In the late 19th century, a British adventurer did the unthinkable. John Keane entered the holy city of Mecca, a place forbidden to all but the devout. Disguised as a Muslim, he risked everything to witness what no other outsider was meant to see, where the smallest mistake could endanger his life. Yet Keane was no ordinary traveler. Born in the port town of Whitby in 1854, John Fryer Thomas Keane was the eldest son of a clergyman. A rebellious spirit from a young age, he was sent to sea at 12 to curb his unruly behavior. But instead, it only fueled his thirst for adventure. By the time he was 23, he had already sailed across the Arctic, the South Seas, and the coasts of India. He'd worked on a sugar plantation in British Guiana and served in the Royal Naval Reserve. His travels took him to places few Europeans had seen, and he learned to speak Hindi with a deep understanding of the customs and cultures of the East. Yet even with his knowledge of Islam and his experience among its followers, he was about to undertake the most dangerous journey of his life, a journey to Mecca in 1877, a city where no non-Muslim was allowed. And so, disguised as a Muslim pilgrim and taking on the name Abdul Rasul, Keane set out to infiltrate the holiest city in Islam. For Muslims, Mecca is the holiest city in the world, a place of pilgrimage that draws the faithful from every corner of the globe. To undertake the Hajj is to fulfill a sacred duty, a duty that unites all believers in a single purpose. As Keane himself observed,
though Mohammedans are divided into almost as many sects and schisms as Christians, they are all agreed on one point, namely, that it is imperative on every Mohammedan who can afford it to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at some time in his life. And it is even considered obligatory on those who may have undertaken the pilgrimage during childhood to remake it when they become adult. Many thousands of Mohammedans assemble at Mecca from all parts of the East during the pilgrim season.
But for an outsider like Keane, a Christian among the devout, the pilgrimage was a journey fraught with peril. In 1877, he set sail from India and landed in Jeddah, the gateway to Mecca, and quickly joined a caravan bound for the holy city, disguised under a borrowed name and borrowed faith.
It was at this place that I was enabled to attach myself to the train of a youthful Hindi Emir, whom I accompanied on pilgrimages to Mecca and other places in the Holy Land of Islam, and of my expedition to Mecca, I shall now attempt to give some account.
From the moment he arrived, Keane's observations were detailed and illuminating. At the port of Jeddah, he watched as his fellow pilgrims were exploited and cheated by their own people, and he knew that his journey would only become more treacherous from here.
On the first landing of these pilgrims at Jeddah, what struck me most was their helplessness and gullibility, for no party of English tourists in Egypt could have been more victimized than were the pilgrims by their brother Mohammedan touts and crimps of Jeddah. Before they landed, a Turkish custom house official demanded 1 rupee a head on no apparent grounds whatever, and then, on landing, charged them a rather high duty on all their baggage by weight.
As Jeddah was a vital port city on the Red Sea, and Britain the dominant naval power in the region, a British consul was stationed there. The consul, upon learning of Keane's intentions, strongly advised him against the journey, warning of bandits and political unrest. But Keane was undeterred. Determined to continue, he shed his Western attire for the robes of a pilgrim, preparing himself for the treacherous road ahead.
He said much to dissuade me, telling me the roads were in an unsafe state, and the country rather disturbed on account of the withdrawal of Turkish troops to the war in Europe. But I had already made up my mind on the subject, and accordingly sold such of my clothes as would be unsuitable and provided myself with a native wardrobe. Then, after a 3 days' rest in Jeddah, I entered into the preparations of our party en route for Mecca.
After 3 days of preparation, Keane and his caravan, led by a young Indian nobleman, set off across the desert. The journey was grueling, the heat unforgiving, and the dangers ever present. At night, Keane struggled to keep his balance on a swaying camel, feeling like a ship tossed in a sea of sand.
I, for my part, spent one of the most wretched and apparently perilous nights I have ever had the misfortune to undergo, for the pitching and rolling of that desert ship could not find its equal afloat, so that I, old sailor as I was, became exceedingly sick, a thing which had not happened to me for many years while at sea.
As they traveled, the air was often filled with the sound of labbaik, the sacred chants of the pilgrims. Labbaik, Allahumma, labbaik, they cried. Here I am, O Allah, here I am. A declaration of their devotion and submission to God. For hours these chants would echo across the desert, a chorus of faith that grew louder as they neared their destination. After 3 days of arduous travel, they finally approached Mecca.
At daylight, when we seemed to have reached the summit of a rocky platform, the increased intensity of the labbaiks and the dismounting of those ahead told that the Mecca was in sight.
Keane joined the throngs of pilgrims streaming toward the Haram, the sacred mosque that houses the Kaaba, the black cube that millions of Muslims around the world face in prayer.
You arrive among collections of high stone buildings scattered over rocky slopes, then dismounting, for it is the proper thing to enter Mecca on foot if possible. I found myself passing along rather wide streets, and between houses of some height. And as you continue on a downhill course, the streets become more narrow and dirty towards the center of the city, where a house had been prepared for us in the walks of the Haram or square, enclosed for public worship, where is situated the Muslim Holy of Holies, the Kaaba.
To remain undetected, Keane knew he had to do more than just look the part. He had to fully immerse himself in the rituals of Islam. Upon arriving in Mecca, he performed what is known as the Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage. He joined the throngs of pilgrims circling the Kaaba, the black cubic structure at the center of the great mosque, 7 times in a ritual known as tawaf. He kissed the black stone embedded in one corner of the Kaaba, an act of reverence that every pilgrim aspired to achieve. Then he completed the sa'i, moving back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa, commemorating Hagar's desperate search for water for her son Ishmael. Throughout these rituals, Keane observed carefully, mimicking the actions of those around him with fervor and precision. He performed the required 2 prostration prayer and, in a final act of devotion, had his head shaved, a symbolic gesture marking the completion of his pilgrimage. All the while, he kept his true identity a secret, aware that even the slightest mistake or misstep could betray him as an outsider in a city where his presence was forbidden.
We had to perform a 2 prostration prayer in one part of the Haram and another in another part. To do the tawaf, i.e. walk, or rather trot, round the Kaaba 7 times, kissing the black stone let into a corner of the building and touching another stone in it at every circuit. The head must be shaved. And now I was at liberty to take off the pilgrim's garb.
He knew that even the slightest mistake could reveal the truth, that he was an outsider in a city where his presence was forbidden. In the 19th century, it was exceedingly rare for a non-Muslim to enter Mecca. Those few who had managed it did so only by adopting a Muslim identity, mastering the complex customs, and always staying vigilant. To Keane, navigating Muslim society was like becoming part of a secretive brotherhood, filled with its own intricate phrases, gestures, and rituals, what he referred to as a kind of freemasonry. He understood that his survival depended on flawlessly mimicking these nuances, learning the 1,000 little signs and elusive phrases that marked a true believer. He adapted quickly, finding a delicate balance between blending in and staying hidden.
Should any but a Mohammedan, from motives of curiosity, gain, or for adventure wish to enter the Hejaz, he must conform to the customs and habits of a Mohammedan and adopt great caution, for notwithstanding the security in which the majority affect to live, there are many jealous and inquisitive watchers, self-constituted spies, who would soon seal the fate of anyone suspected of insincerity. But let him be master of the 1,000 little signs and elusive phrases of Mohammedan Freemasonry, and let him affect minutely all observances and points of etiquette among Mohammedans, and sustain throughout a character for devotion, and he need fear no inconvenience on the score of his nationality in a place like Mecca.
To survive, Keane had to do more than just act like a Muslim. He had to become one. Islam, he quickly discovered, was not a monolithic faith, but a religion rich with diverse schools of thought, cultural practices, and interpretations. What was considered acceptable in one community could be frowned upon or even condemned in another. This diversity added a complex layer for Keane to navigate. He had to constantly gauge the beliefs and practices of those around him, adjusting his behavior accordingly to avoid suspicion. something as simple as a name could become a matter of contention. He initially chose the name Abdul Rasul, the servant of the Prophet, a name that was common among Indian Muslims. However, upon reaching Arabia, where interpretations of Islam were often stricter, he realized that his chosen name was seen as inappropriate. To many, the idea of being a servant of the Prophet was unacceptable because it conflicted with the belief that only God should be served. Recognizing the potential danger, Keane quickly adapted, changing his name to Mohammeden, a more universally acceptable name across the Muslim world. This subtle yet crucial adjustment was just one of many he made to maintain his disguise and ensure his safety.
The name I had adopted, the servant of the Prophet, though common in several forms in India, was objected to by the most correct of our party as not strictly orthodox, for, said they, was not Mohammed himself the servant of God? I thought this would be very inconvenient, as a cause of discussion bringing me into uncoveted notice, and added Amin to the name I had already adopted. Then dropping the servant, by an easy transition, I became known as Mohammed Amin, a name which I supposed could not be objected to by any Mohammedans, no matter of what peculiar persuasion.
In the 19th century, making the pilgrimage to Mecca was the journey of a lifetime, one that required months of planning and travel. Pilgrims from across the Muslim world would set sail well before the annual Hajj season, often spending weeks on the open sea before arriving in Jeddah, the gateway to Mecca. Once there, they would settle into the holy city, acclimatizing themselves and preparing spiritually and physically for the great pilgrimage rite of Hajj. Keane was among these early arrivals, and he knew that, to maintain his disguise, he needed to immerse himself fully in the rituals and customs that defined life in Mecca. Every gesture, every word held significance. Every action needed to be carefully calibrated to avoid suspicion.
Observing and inquiring were now the only things which recalled me to my identity. I had become so accustomed to my surroundings and accommodated myself to circumstances so rapidly that in 6 weeks I was as much at home as if I had been a Mohammedan all my life. I formed friends, had little tiffs and jealousies with my companions in the household, we all having the same interests and even eating out of the same plates.
Living in Mecca came with its own set of rules, strict and unyielding. Fighting, shedding blood, or even killing a simple fly could be considered a grave offense. The sanctity of life extended to every living creature in Mecca, and Keane quickly learned that even the smallest misstep could attract unwanted attention.
I was not supposed to have any intercourse with my harem, if I had had one, nor to indulge in any feasting, sports, or amusements, other than those allowable on religious grounds. Fighting and the shedding of blood were especially to be abstained from, and killing of vermin, flies, worms, etc. were almost equally reprehensible, on account of the probability of offending a jinn, a class of spirit which is believed to take this form and to be especially abundant in Mecca.
In the 19th century, the city of Mecca and the surrounding region of the Hejaz were part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was common to see Turkish troops stationed throughout the area to maintain order and protect the holy sites. While their presence was a reminder of imperial authority, it also meant that they had access to supplies that the local population often found scarce. Keane struggled with the local diet, finding little satisfaction in the traditional meals of curry and rice, and often remained hungry despite eating large portions. The unfamiliar food seemed to have little effect in quelling his appetite. Surrounded by devout pilgrims and Ottoman soldiers, Keane navigated a complex web of social interactions, adapting as best he could to the realities of life in the holy city.
For the rice I ate, no matter how much, never satisfied my cravings, it having, as far as my experience goes, much the same effect on a hungry man as salt water on a thirsty one. I sometimes went out into the streets and purchased bread from the Turkish soldiers who sell their rations.
But amidst these difficulties, there were moments of awe and wonder. The end of the holy month of Ramadan brought with it the Great Feast, a celebration that drew the entire population out into the streets, dressed in their most colorful attire. Thousands gathered around the Kaaba, creating a sea of believers in vibrant robes, bowing and prostrating in unison.
The great feast lasting for 3 days brought out the whole population, decked in their gaudiest apparel, while the guns from each of the 3 Turkish forts fired a salute of 21 at the times of the sunrise, noon, and sunset, calls to prayers on each of the 3 days. It was an imposing spectacle to see those thousands of bearded, turbaned, hard, worldly men standing, circle widening upon circle, round their sacred Kaaba, silently following the Imam as he praised God and blessed Mohammed.
As the days passed, Keane grew more confident in navigating the city. He explored its winding streets and climbed its hills, taking note of its irregular, chaotic architecture. A jumble of buildings crammed together with no apparent plan. On one of his excursions, he ascended a hill overlooking Mecca, said to be the site of miracles performed by the Prophet Muhammad. From there, he observed the city below.
On this hill, Jebel Kubais, Muhammad is said to have wrestled with a great infidel, one Nimrud, and defeated him by a miracle. The whole of this valley, about 1.5 miles long by 1/3 of a mile across, is packed and crammed with buildings of all shapes and sizes, placed in no kind of order, a curious grey mass, flat-topped, to an European eye roofless.
Inside the Haram, the sacred mosque, Keane observed the unique behaviors and solemn expressions of the worshippers. He learned to follow the unspoken rules, how to handle his shoes, how to keep his feet tucked under while sitting, and how to avoid eye contact with the beggars who moved about silently, collecting alms. He watched the rituals and routines of the faithful, noting how every gesture seemed to hold a hidden meaning, a secret language of devotion.
What is very noticeable on first entering the sacred precincts is the general solemn expression of the faces round you. Should you carry your shoes in your hand, as some do who may be going out by a different gate from the one by which they entered, you must hold them soul to soul. Only privileged beggars are to be met with in the Haram, such as maimed or very old.
As the days passed in Mecca, Keane found comfort in the rituals of his new life. He developed a fondness for the hookah, its soothing smoke a welcome relief in the intense environment. Evenings were spent entertaining his companions with wild tales of his seafaring adventures, stories that blended fact with fiction. These moments of camaraderie solidified his place among the pilgrims, making him a trusted and well-liked figure.
Sometimes I would tell a story, something in this style. The Emir begins by asking me, "You have been in many countries, Mohammed Amin?" "Why not, Your Honor? Is not my work sailing? I have heard there is a big fish in the sea, bigger than a ship. I have seen many and hunted them in the sea to the south of India." And so go on to give a long account of whaling. Or I would tell of a country where the sun does not set for 6 months, where there is hardly any land to be seen. All ice, ice, ice. The Emir has said, "Good. Is there such a place in the world?" "Yes." "Good. If there is nothing but ice, for what do ships go?" "Oh, there is a big animal called walrus, as big as 2 camels, having the body of an ox, the feet of a crocodile, the head of a tiger, tusks like an elephant, and tail of a fish. It is very fat, and we went to hunt them." I can see incredulity on every countenance, and the Emir puts a final clencher with "good." And what can it get to eat to make it so fat? The fish in the sea. Here follow general laughter and exclamations of, "God, what a father of lies!" I invented many wonderful stories to amuse them, and found, here as everywhere, truth less credited than fiction.
But life in Mecca was far from predictable. One day, during a routine visit to the barber, Keane's world was turned upside down by a single, casual remark. The barber mentioned an Englishwoman living within the city, a revelation that seemed impossible. An Englishwoman in Mecca? Keane's mind raced with questions, but he kept his composure, careful not to reveal his shock.
One day, when work and talk were rather slack, the old fellow casually remarked, "There is an Englishwoman in Mecca, the Lady Venus by name." This was an eye-opener, though I took care not to show it, merely replying in an uninterested way, "Praise be to God, how long has she been here?" "Many years."
Intrigued and unable to resist the mystery, Keane arranged a clandestine meeting. The next day, with his heart pounding, he made his way to the agreed location. There, in a small, unassuming room, he met the Lady Venus. She was veiled, her face hidden, but as they spoke in English, Keane quickly realized that she was indeed an Englishwoman, just as the barber had said. Their conversation was cautious, both acutely aware of the danger surrounding them.
She evidently understood my real character, and it seemed a painful interview to her. We sat silently for some minutes. At length, the Molvi spoke to her in Arabic, telling her to ask me some questions in English, as my name, age, country, employment, all of which I answered as I wished the Molvi to believe.
The revelation left Keane both exhilarated and deeply uneasy. Here was another foreigner, trapped in Mecca, living a life of secrecy and fear. Their meeting, though brief, was a rare connection in a place where both of them were outsiders, surviving on their wits and the thin veil of deception that protected them.
We asked one another questions and asked others without waiting for answers. Before parting, she raised her veil and showed me her face, which was as English as my own.
Yet life in Mecca continued to evolve. The Emir, Keane's host, suddenly announced his intention to embark on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, leaving Keane and a few others behind to manage the household. The decision threw the household into a flurry of activity as they prepared for the Emir's departure, a chaotic scramble to pack supplies and make arrangements. Left behind while his patron, the Indian Emir, ventured on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Keane was now in charge of the household. With time on his hands and a new sense of freedom, Keane found himself becoming more embedded in local Meccan life.
For my part, I became quite an Eastern swell. My tunic of the whitest, my turban of the largest and brightest. The idea of any rowdy Arab questioning me as to who I was never for a moment entered into my calculations.
Keane had grown increasingly comfortable in his disguise and felt secure in his new identity. But an unexpected incident would soon put his carefully constructed facade to the test. As he stood watching a group of local children playing outside a local school, he found himself suddenly the focus of unwanted attention.
One day I was passing a large college on the outskirts of the town when the students, about 150 of all ages from 5 to 15, were out playing. I stayed to look on at their various games, such as marbles. Not unlike the English game, as far as I could see. One little group had an old pistol, snapping caps, and altogether I was much amused watching them, when a little Hindi child near me shouted, "Oh, look at the Christian!" I shall never be able to guess what put it into that son of Iblis's head. Perhaps he had seen Englishmen in India and was struck with a fancied resemblance, or it may have been only for fun, though Eastern children are not generally given to unprovoked mischief. Up to this, nothing of the kind had happened to me, and as it was unexpected, it took me very much aback. It also collected all the young imps in the neighbourhood, who took up the cry, and one great hulking brute stepped up to me and said in a blustering manner, "Christian dog, if you are a Mohammedan, make the profession of your faith."
Things quickly went from bad to worse. Instead of calmly asserting his faith as any devout Muslim would have done, Keane's temper flared. In a moment of frustration, he lashed out, grabbing his accuser by the shoulders and kicking him to the ground. A deeply offensive act in a society where such an insult was considered one of the gravest humiliations. His reaction only fueled the growing crowd's anger, and suddenly he found himself at the center of a volatile situation, surrounded by shouts and jeers. They began to pelt him with stones. Desperate, Keane seized a young boy and used him as a shield, rushing towards a nearby Turkish guardhouse. The guardhouse provided temporary shelter, but the tension was palpable. Keane had narrowly escaped an ordeal that could have ended in disaster. The incident had drawn far too much attention, and Keane knew he couldn't afford another mistake. With the Emir, his only potential protector, away on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Keane decided to keep a low profile. He withdrew from the public eye, avoiding any unnecessary outings or encounters, and resolved to remain as inconspicuous as possible until things cooled down.
I moved my clothes and blankets into a little closet off the cooking room. I did not stir out of it till the Emir's return, about 3 weeks. My companions stuck to me like bricks, giving out at my request that I had gone to Jeddah.
During Keane's confinement, the days felt long and anxiety gnawed at him. It was then that he turned to a remedy that, surprisingly, was available in 19th century Mecca. Opium. Keane found himself taking small doses at first to calm his nerves. As days turned into weeks, the opium dulled his fears and blurred the edges of reality, providing an escape from the tension of living in disguise. But it also began to cloud his judgment, drawing him deeper into its soothing haze.
It was not so much caution kept me confined the whole time as the ball of opium, a small pill of which I took the first night and continued to take every day, increasing the dose as I found it affecting me.
As the days passed, he found himself consuming more and more, lulled by its seductive effects. His days slipped by in a haze of dreams and altered perceptions. Time seemed to blur, and the weight of his predicament lightened.
I will not go into the pains and pleasures of opium eating more than to say the 3 weeks passed like 3 days. I was perfectly happy. Everything appeared couleur de rose.
For Keane, the opium offered an unexpected escape from the anxiety and tedium of his confinement. Even the constant chanting of pilgrims in the Haram, once grating to his ears, took on a different character. The drug's influence turned the repetitive religious droning into something strangely soothing, almost like a melody from his homeland.
Groups of devotees sitting under my window in the Haram chanting La ilaha illallah over and over and over in a sing-song tuneful sort of no-tune, which had before been most distressing to listen to, would now transform themselves in my waking dreams into some merry English party, a picnic perhaps.
Keane's Indian companions, rather than scolding him, seemed to understand Keane's need for it, perhaps recognizing a shared desire to find solace amid the tensions of their unusual circumstances.
He knew I was under opium and sympathized with me and could recommend nothing better, looking upon that drug as a specific for all maladies.
During this time, his small group continued to live modestly, their expenses carefully managed. Each day they pooled their money to buy provisions from the bustling bazaars. The shopping list was simple yet sufficient: meat from camels or goats, fresh vegetables like parsley, beetroot, and carrots, and staple items like lentils and bread. They purchased milk by the pint and sour milk for their curries, while a handful of chilies and spices added a much-needed kick to their otherwise bland meals. Keane even managed to budget for small luxuries, such as a few ounces of sugar or a bit of Turkish tobacco for his companions to enjoy with their tea. Water was another essential, brought to the house in small goat skins, and even something as simple as wood for the fire needed to be bought daily. Despite the simplicity of their diet, Keane found ways to stretch their provisions, often supplementing their meals with cheaper items like dates and tamarinds. The group even indulged in occasional sweets or fruit when they could afford it, small pleasures that helped lift their spirits amid the uncertainty of their stay in Mecca. Once the Emir returned, bringing with him tales of adventure and exotic treasures, Keane ventured back into the streets. With a sharper awareness of the dangers around him, he chose his movements more carefully, always aware of who might be watching.
I went about a good deal with the Emir now, and wore a less conspicuous dress, keeping more in the background.
Keane found himself back at the very same college where he had been pelted with rocks just weeks earlier. This time, however, he was in the company of the Emir, a respected figure, and none of the boys dared to question his presence. The same students who had been so quick to accuse and attack him before now avoided eye contact, clearly intimidated by the change in his circumstances. Keane took full advantage of this newfound protection, quietly observing the scene and blending in without attracting any unwanted attention.
We paid a visit to the college, the scene of my unlucky encounter. The boys looked very sheepish and pretended not to recognize me when they saw me in such good company, and you may be sure I let well alone. While in the courtyard, I heard a great squalling and crying coming from one of the rooms. Unable to resist my curiosity, I slipped away from the group and approached the door. Inside, I saw a whole class of about 20 boys being punished. Half had already undergone the bastinado and were sitting around the walls blubbering with red faces, while 5 others were getting it. 2 big boys held either end of a thick stick with a rope noose in the middle. Each culprit was made to put a foot in the noose, which was then twisted until the feet were squeezed together and lifted breast high. A burly Arab tutor then brought down a Malacca cane on their toes with full force, showing no mercy. The yells, struggles, and wild flailing of the boys made it clear that the punishment was very effective indeed.
Keane also explored the many shrines and holy places that surrounded Mecca, each one tied to a story or miracle from Islamic tradition. Yet he found the constant repetition of miraculous tales overwhelming, and his frustration grew with every new legend he encountered.
"What are you picking up that stone for?" you inquire. "Oh, Mohammed was fighting infidels, and God sent angels and a shower. Why are you eating that shrub?" "Oh, this is called the Prophet's bread. Mohammed and his companions were starving in the desert, and he told them to take this. Rocks, pools, holes in the ground, she-camels, dogs, cats, rats, mice. Mohammed, 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 Mohammed. I used to find a quiet place and sit down and say over all the swearing I knew in 5 languages."
Still, there were moments of quiet beauty, especially at the Haram, the sacred mosque surrounding the Kaaba. The sheer devotion of the pilgrims left a deep impression on Keane, despite his growing weariness.
The Kaaba, in the middle of that enclosure, is called the center of the world, the Mohammedan hub of the universe. The whole ground within the outer bounds of the arcades is deemed part of heaven on earth.
As the days passed, more and more pilgrims flooded into Mecca, their numbers swelling the city to its limits. Keane marveled at the diversity of the crowds, how they jostled together without conflict, united by their shared faith.
The town was packed till there was scarcely standing room in some of the streets. Quarrelling of any kind is seldom seen in the streets, which is very creditable, considering the number of different nationalities and sects brought into close contact here.
But beneath the calm surface, tensions simmered. On one occasion, Keane witnessed a violent clash between 2 pilgrims. The brutality of the confrontation and its swift, bloody resolution served as a stark reminder of the underlying currents of violence that flowed through the holy city.
2 Punjabis, tearing mad, were scratching and slapping one another, their faces contorted with rage as they flailed at each other in a frenzy. A Turkish soldier who was patrolling the street noticed the commotion and approached to separate them. As he moved to intervene, one of the Punjabis turned on the Turk, slapping him across the face with an open hand. The Turkish soldier's eyes flashed with anger. Without hesitation, he drew his sword bayonet and, with a swift motion, smote the Punjabi a swinging slash on the neck, cutting the head half off.
Keane's observations of the various groups in Mecca reveal a vivid tapestry of cultures, traditions, and social hierarchies. His Victorian perspectives often reflect the biases of his time, yet they offer a rare glimpse into the diversity of people who gathered in this holy city during the 19th century. Keane describes the Turks as the most civilized and orderly among the various groups he encountered. He appreciated their clean, disciplined appearance and considered them far more advanced than their fellow Muslims.
The Turk certainly appears to advantage as the most civilized, clean, and sensible of them all. Bad as he is as as much superior to other Easterns as any European nation is to him.
Yet despite his admiration, Keane notes that the Turks are unpopular in Mecca due to their adoption of European customs and their dismissive attitude toward other Muslim groups.
The Turks, as the ruling power, are hated and feared not only by their unwilling subjects, the natives of the Hejaz, but by all other Mohammedans. They do not hesitate to increase their unpopularity by a high-handed and bullying carriage.
Keane's view of the Arabs is less favorable. He describes them as crafty and aggressive, adept at fleecing unsuspecting pilgrims. According to him, they are skilled in languages and possess a certain cleverness, but they are also known for their relentless pursuit of money.
The Arabs are sanctified Meccans who honor you by accepting charity. Blustering, frauds, swindlers to a man, trained from infancy to the rooking of the pilgrim pigeon. They are perfect in every dodge, an art of crimping and cadging.
The Indians are portrayed with a mixture of respect and criticism. Keane notes their resilience and cunning in navigating the social intricacies of Mecca, but he also describes them as beggars, albeit subtle ones.
The Hindi are all beggars from top to bottom, underhand insinuating beggars. The Arab demands bakshish. The Hindi cringingly pleads for charity.
Despite this, he observes that many Hindis are well established and hold significant positions, ranging from shopkeepers to professors of law. He also highlights their ability to endure extreme poverty with remarkable fortitude.
There seems no bottom to the depths of wretchedness and misery to which the Hindi can descend and live.
On the other hand, Keane has a positive impression of the Malays, whom he respects for their honesty, self-sufficiency, and straightforward nature. Unlike other groups, they never beg and manage to maintain a certain dignity even in the bustling environment of Mecca.
So far as I could ascertain, the Malay permanent residents in Mecca are limited to but some half-dozen. It is known they never set out on a pilgrimage without sufficient funds to ensure their return, and it has become a byword among the Arabs that they never beg, and a common Arab expression, which may be freely translated, "no humbug in the Malay," perfectly describes them. Quiet and fairly honourable in their dealings, yet close-fisted, they may be called the Scotchmen of the East, and are the most rational of the pilgrims.
Keane also mentions the Persians, who remain somewhat isolated due to their unorthodox beliefs. He describes them as quiet and inoffensive, often traveling in groups and conducting their own prayers apart from the rest. In contrast, the Mughrebis, Arabs from North Africa, are depicted as unruly and unhygienic. Keane describes them as quarrelsome and neglectful of religious practices, often behaving in a way that even other Arabs find disagreeable. He makes special mention of the magical practices, for which they are known.
The Moorish magician exists, and a great deal of faith is placed in the charms these Mughrebis profess to work, especially by the Hindis. I myself underwent an exorcism for the curing of a large boil on my forehead at the hands of a hoary old thief. It consisted in squeezing and stroking my head and shoulders, at the same time muttering incantations with closed eyes and many minor gesticulations, drawing mystic signs and strange devices, mingled with the written names of God and Mohammed on a small piece of paper, then soaking it in a solution of common salt.
Keane devotes a significant portion of his observations to the plight of black Africans in Mecca, many of whom were enslaved. His reflections, aimed at an educated British audience, acknowledge the prevailing anti-slavery sentiment in Britain, where slavery had been abolished in 1833. However, he offers a more nuanced view, contrasting the Eastern slave trade with the transatlantic slave trade that his readers would have been more familiar with. Keane remarks,
"The Negroes are the porters, water carriers, and performers of most of the real labor in Mecca. Happy, healthy, well-fed, well-clothed, as such things go in Mecca, they are slaves, proud of their masters, in a country where the slave is honored only after his master."
He draws attention to what he sees as significant differences between slavery in the East and the brutal conditions of the transatlantic trade, suggesting that in some cases, Eastern slavery provided more opportunity for improvement than what he had seen elsewhere.
Slavery in the East has an elevating influence over thousands of human beings, and but for it, hundreds of thousands of souls must have passed their existence in this world as wild savages, little better than animals. It at least makes men of them, useful men too, sometimes even superior men.
Keane also draws on his personal experience working in the British West Indies to critique British hypocrisy. He highlights the harsh conditions faced by Indian laborers, known as coolies, who were technically free but subjected to severe exploitation.
I have been an overseer on a sugar plantation in the West Indies, where 300 of these coolies were employed, helpless droves of strangers in a strange land, worked in a manner killing to the feeble Hindi, for the most paltry remuneration out of which they must save enough to pay for the return passage. At the very most, 1 in 10 again saw India.
Keane is also critical of British efforts to suppress the Arab slave trade through naval intervention in the waters of the Persian Gulf. He argues that these actions merely force slavers to adopt more dangerous methods, rather than reducing the demand for slaves.
What was before a legitimate peaceful trade has now become a dangerous adventure for the procurers of slaves. The ill treatment practiced on their cargoes necessarily increases with the danger of carrying them.
He recounts an unsettling anecdote from a Yemeni sailor that illustrates the brutal consequences of British interference.
A dhow in which he was serving had on board 2 Negroes, nominally slaves, who had for 5 months worked on board the dhow, and who, knowing when they were well off, would not have taken their liberty had it been offered them. On the day, after clearing the Straits of Hormuz, they sighted an English man-of-war steaming towards them. The 2 Negroes would have been enough to condemn their craft, which meant ruin to some and misfortune more or less to every man of the crew, so they killed them and threw them overboard.
Keane concludes by suggesting that the British attempts to abolish the Arab slave trade were misguided and counterproductive, pushing the trade further underground and leading to greater suffering. Keane's observations extend to the Bedouin, who, according to him, seem out of place in the city. He describes them as uncomfortable and awkward in the urban environment, far removed from their natural desert habitat. Finally, Keane talks about the diverse group of Tartars and other Central Asians who travel to Mecca. These hardy pilgrims often endure months of travel on foot and perform their devotions with a fervor that impresses even Keane. John Keane observed that Mecca, nestled within a barren valley surrounded by rugged hills, stood as a testament to nature's relentless forces. The land was marked by rapid geological changes, driven by extremes of heat and cold, winds that carried abrasive sands, and the occasional violent rainstorm. He noted that the hills around Mecca were composed of every conceivable type of rock, plutonic, metamorphic, and eruptive, often piled in chaotic formations. To Keane, they resembled the exposed bones of the earth, a vivid display of the ongoing disintegration of the landscape. He described how the rocks cracked in the cold night air and crumbled to dust under the fierce desert sun, creating heaps of rubble that seemed to grow daily. One day, while sitting on a hill near the Sultan's Road, he noticed a massive stone heap alongside the path, stretching for about 400 yards. He realized it had been formed by Bedouins who, while leading their camels, tossed aside any stones large enough to injure the animal's feet. This simple act, repeated countless times, had created a vast mound that seemed almost as ancient and unchanging as the hills themselves. Life in Mecca, as Keane experienced it, was a mixture of chaos and resilience. Keane marveled at the city's ability to avoid major epidemics, given its lack of proper drainage and its reliance on wells that likely drew from sewage-tainted water. He was struck by the seeming contradiction of a place that, in his words, was a cesspool, yet remained relatively free of widespread disease. He attributed this to the city's dry climate, which prevented the usual spread of illness. However, many of the local inhabitants believed that Mecca was under divine protection, a view that Keane seemed to regard with a mix of skepticism and fascination. He observed,
"It is not surprising that Mohammedans attribute the comparatively small rate of mortality among the community to a perpetual miraculous interposition of providence in behalf of Mecca the inviolable."
Commerce in Mecca, as Keane saw it, thrived on a lively mix of cultures and currencies. The bazaars were bustling with activity, filled with merchants selling everything from daily necessities to exotic goods brought from distant lands. Unlike other cities in the East, where shops selling similar items were typically clustered together, the markets in Mecca were more eclectic. A single street might have a dealer in European goods next to a fruit vendor, a baker, and a gunsmith. Keane noted that despite the diversity and the potential for chaos, there was a surprising degree of order and honesty in the city's markets. However, he also witnessed the resourcefulness and cunning of the merchants. He recounted the story of an Egyptian trader who tried to sell eau de cologne as a medicine for head or heartache. The trader's scheme was profitable until it was discovered that the liquid was actually a spirit. leading to his stock being smashed in the streets by an outraged mob. Keane also paid close attention to the currency used in Mecca, which was as diverse as the city's population. The most common coin was the Austrian Maria Theresa dollar, which, despite being dated 1790, seemed to appear in surprisingly new condition, leading Keane to suspect they were still being minted. He observed that money changers thrived, charging a standard fee to exchange currency, yet there was a persistent shortage of small change, adding complexity to daily transactions. After several weeks in Mecca, Keane's journey culminated in one of the most significant Islamic rituals, the Hajj pilgrimage. Taking place once a year, the Hajj is a sacred duty for Muslims worldwide, drawing pilgrims from every corner of the globe to Mecca. This is the time when Mecca becomes most crowded, bustling with the presence of millions of the faithful. For those who undertake the pilgrimage, it is a journey of physical endurance and deep spiritual significance. In December of 1877, Keane found himself among this immense gathering, preparing to observe and participate in a series of profound rituals that constitute the Hajj. On December 14th, the Day of Standing at Mount Arafat, also known as the Day of Standing, marked the pinnacle of the pilgrimage. That year, the Hajj fell on a Friday, making it the Greater Pilgrimage, which drew an even larger crowd than usual. The day before, nearly 200,000 pilgrims poured out of Mecca toward the plains of Arafat. The mass departure was chaotic, yet strangely organized, with everyone moving at their own pace, laden with their own provisions and plans. Upon reaching the village of Mina, located just outside Mecca, Keane was struck by the transformation of the small village into a vibrant fairground. Stalls selling everything from provisions to tobacco lined the streets, and pilgrims in their white garments filled every space. It was here that Keane witnessed the arrival of the Shereef of Mecca, a figure of immense local and religious importance. Although Mecca was part of the Ottoman Empire, with the Sultan in Istanbul as the highest authority, the Shereef held a unique position. As a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, he was the local, nominal ruler, whose noble ancestry afforded him a place of respect among Muslims. His presence at the Hajj was a significant event, and his arrival was marked by a colorful and chaotic procession.
First came the Shereef's vanguard, about 100 barebacked camels, each ridden by 2 armed Bedouin, a spearman in front and a matchlock man behind, the choicest collection of Badawi rags and filth I ever had the pleasure of contemplating. After these came 12 led horses in gold and silver trappings, following one another in line, light bays and chestnuts, in rather too good condition for work, but compact, muscular, pretty little animals, each one handsomer than the last, and if they had gone on following one another all day, you could not have taken your eyes off.
As the procession moved past, Keane noted the presence of the Shereef himself, a slight, wiry man of dark complexion, dressed in the robes of a Bedouin chieftain. Riding a beautiful gray horse, he cut a striking figure, blending tradition and authority. Following him were his sons or nephews, also mounted and dressed in similar attire, along with a host of attendants, armed functionaries and musicians. This spectacle illustrated the Shereef's unique role, balancing his duties as a local leader and his ceremonial importance during the Hajj. Once at Arafat, Keane climbed the hill to gain a better view of the vast crowd gathered for prayer. From his vantage point, he observed the immense sea of pilgrims, all dressed in white, moving like waves across the plain. The anticipation in the air was palpable, as everyone waited for the midday sermon, a central moment of the pilgrimage. The atmosphere grew increasingly fervent, with waves of chanting and prayers rising and falling.
The whole multitude was now worked up to the highest pitch of excitement, individuals expressing the greatest emotion, while some were quite frantic, and the scene had become a perfect pandemonium. There was something eerie, almost horrible, about it to me, an unimpassioned observer. I felt like a sane man among 300,000 lunatics.
As the afternoon wore on, the pilgrims descended from Mount Arafat and continued their journey to Muzdalifa, where they would collect stones for the next day's ritual in Mina. This ritual, known as the stoning of the devil, The act of collecting the stones was filled with symbolic meaning, with each pilgrim carefully selecting exactly 63 small stones.
This rite is to commemorate Abraham's stoning the devil at the advice of the angel Gabriel when tempted by Satan at these 3 places. We repeated this throwing of stones on each of the 2 next days. The popular belief is that they are conveyed back to Muzdalifa by angels.
The following day, as Keane and others returned to Mecca, he was struck by the eerie emptiness of the usually vibrant city. The streets, recently bustling with activity, were now almost entirely deserted. The only remaining signs of life were a few beggars who had been too weak to join the pilgrimage, and stray dogs, scavenging what they could find.
As we approached the Haram, we came upon some beggars sitting and lying at the roadside who had been in extremis or too feeble to join the pilgrimage. Such as were alive, for some were actually dead, greeted us most piteously, imploring us for food. And a hungry time they must have had of it. It was not so with the dogs, as they had been making horribly free with the legs of the defunct.
One day, while weaving through a throng of pilgrims, Keane came across an unusual sign in English hanging above a doorway. The sign simply read, "Lodgings." In 19th century Mecca, an English sign was a rare and out-of-place sight, one that immediately aroused his curiosity. Keane lingered near a small tobacco shop opposite the building, making small purchases and striking up a conversation with the shopkeeper. He was wondering who might live in such a house when a tall, fair-skinned man, who looked almost like an Arab, emerged from the door, whistling. Sensing an opportunity, Keane greeted him in English. "Good morning," said Keane. "Well, Do you speak English?" "Yes," the man replied. "Good morning." The man, somewhat taken aback, scrutinized Keane for a moment, and then asked with a serious tone, "You are not an Englishman, are you?" Keane, sensing the need for caution, feigned a broken English accent, trying to appear harmless.
"Oh yes, I am Englishman. I am speaking the English very well."
Keane replied in his best imitation of a foreign accent. This seemed to put the man at ease. The man introduced himself as a Malay from the Cape of Good Hope. He explained that he was one of many English-speaking Muslims who had come to Mecca for the pilgrimage. Over the years, his people had faced much discrimination.
The authorities had only allowed us to live in Mecca on the condition that we spoke no language but Arabic. If an Arab heard us speaking otherwise, he was at liberty to beat us, and we dared not retaliate. The strict old Pasha enforced the laws to the letter. You see those beggars missing hands or feet. That's his doing.
Despite these hardships, the Cape Malay now felt more comfortable in Mecca. He was making a living, but he confessed he missed certain comforts from home, like beer and potatoes. He told Keane he had attended an English school in his youth and could read and write well. They continued talking for a while, but when Keane began to ask more personal questions, the Malay grew suspicious and abruptly ended the conversation. The next day, Keane found himself among the throngs gathered at the Haram. On this day, the Kaaba was to be opened for those who had not been in Mecca during Ramadan, a rare opportunity that even most devout Muslims never experience. After 2 hours of jostling and waiting, Keane managed to gain entry. Inside, he was struck by what he saw in this most sacred chamber.
As I entered, I saw the red hangings of the walls and ceiling, richly embroidered in gold. 3 great pillars supported the flat roof, and between them, a number of dim lamps hung suspended from metal crossbars. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, as if filled with the prayers of centuries.
Keane's thoughts kept returning to the woman he had met earlier, the one he called Lady Venus. They had managed to arrange a discreet meeting at a Quran binder's shop. Lady Venus told him about her past, a tale filled with hardship and pain. She had been in India during the rebellion of 1857, when British forces and loyalists were besieged by Indian rebels. The siege had lasted from May until November 1857, resulting in heavy casualties and suffering on both sides.
I had been at Lucknow during the siege, taken by a leading rebel. We fled India, chased by the English, who set a price on his head. He died 8 years ago, leaving me in this place. Now, I live by embroidering skull caps for the bazaar. just another stranger in this foreign land.
She spoke little of whether she had gone willingly or as a captive. She described a harrowing journey, ending up in Mecca with her captor, where she had lived in poverty since his death. Keane listened with fascination to her stories, realizing the hidden layers of life in this sacred city. Here, amid the devout pilgrims and sacred rituals, were tales of intrigue, tragedy, and survival. In this unique city, even those with the most divergent paths seemed to find themselves intertwined, drawn together by fate, faith, or mere chance. After his 6 months in Mecca, John Keane's fascination with Arabia and his commitment to uncovering its hidden world led him to undertake another daring journey from Mecca to Medina and back. This adventure would become the subject of his second book, in which he continued to provide unique insights and vivid descriptions of a land that few outsiders had seen. Following his return to England in the winter of 1878, Keane remained preoccupied with the fate of the Lady Venus. Her presence in that sacred city was an enigma that refused to resolve itself, lingering in his mind long after he had left its walls. Determined to discover more about her story, or at least ensure her safety, Keane shared his account with several gentlemen well-versed in Eastern affairs. His tale quickly caught their attention, and they in turn relayed it to the British government. Responding to the unusual circumstances, the Foreign Office directed their consulate in Jeddah to send an agent into Mecca to inquire about the woman. The investigation confirmed Keane's account. An Englishwoman had indeed been living in Mecca. But by the time the agent arrived, she had already left the city, traveling to India with the family who had sheltered her. The India office then took up the task, tracing her movements and eventually locating her. An English magistrate, curious about this mysterious figure, arranged for his wife to meet with the woman in question. During their long conversation, the magistrate's wife found that the woman matched Keane's description, yet when asked directly, she denied being an Englishwoman, maintaining her adopted identity. Despite her denials, the magistrate harbored doubts. There was something about her fluency in English, her manners and her demeanor that did not quite align with the story she now told. Still, he felt constrained by the evidence, or lack thereof, and was careful not to press her too hard. He understood that after years of hardship and isolation, she might have reasons of her own to remain hidden in her current life.
She is under no restraint whatever, beyond such as is imposed on females of her creed and country, and has nothing to complain of, has neither friends nor relations according to her own account, and is treated more as a companion than as a dependent by the members of Mohammed's family.
She remains a figure caught between worlds, her true story locked away, perhaps never to be fully known. Keane fulfilled his part by sharing what he had discovered, but it was clear that some stories resist conclusion, hidden like the woman herself behind layers of time and circumstance.